Good afternoon and welcome to Liquid Lunch with the Regional Water Authority here on 103.5 WNHH. You can watch us anytime on video on New Haven Independent's YouTube page or listen to us as a podcast on Apple or Spotify. I'm Kevin Watsey. I am the Director of Public Relations for the Regional Water Authority, and I am a water nerd. And it's October. If you're listening to this live, it is October. It's a couple of weeks before Halloween. The air is crisp, the leaves are falling, and there is no better time than to talk about today's topic, bats. Now, you may be thinking, Kevin, this is Liquid Lunch. You're a water nerd. What are you talking about bats for? Well, the answer is simple. Bats are crucial to the ecosystem, and the RWA has a very special location within our watershed related to bats. So we're going to discuss that today. We're going to discuss everything we could possibly discuss about bats. With our guest, she is the wildlife biologist for the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, also known as DEEP, Devon Frazier. She and the department are partnering with the RWA on a study of a location within our watershed where we have some bats, and we're going to talk about that. But first, as we do every show, we're going to welcome Devon to the show and ask her to tell us her story. How did you become a wildlife biologist, and did you come about to study bats?
So first of all, thank you for having me today to talk about my favorite topic, which is bats. Going back to my childhood, I wanted to be a veterinarian, much like many young children want to be a veterinarian. And it wasn't until I got to college and I took a vertebrate zoology class, and all of our TAs were wildlife biologists. And I found out that that was actually a thing, that you could work with animals in another capacity outside of just being a veterinarian. So that launched, college launched my career ambitions. I spent the next post-college 7 or 8 years just working different projects across the country. I've lived in lots of places in the United States. I went to South Africa for about 6 months and got to study carnivores in South Africa. And then I just hopped around. I worked with prairie chickens in Kansas. I worked with lynx and snowshoe hare in Colorado, songbirds in Minnesota, and then finally bats in Kentucky in 2008 or 9, I think. And once I met bats, I fell in love. It was instant love. They're amazing animals. And that was really kind of the launch and the point at which I decided to transition my career path into going back to grad school. So I got into UCLA did my doctorate at UCLA, focused almost exclusively on bats. And so, I've just been kind of bouncing around and working with wildlife for many, many years and many, many species. And then once I got the chance to work with bats, it was like love at first sight, and I was hooked. So
it's kind of like you were dating the other animals, and then you met the bats,
exactly.
And now you're married to the bats. So
married to the bats.
You're married to the bats. You've studied a lot of other animals. What would you say is the most unusual animal you studied? Maybe one we've never even heard of.
I don't think I worked with a lot of very charismatic species kind of in the beginning. So again, mountain lions, lynx, bobcats, all the fancy carnivores, and that's kind of always what I thought I would work with. But then I'm going to default to bats. Bats are the most interesting. In terms of the mammals, they kind of win in terms of just how interesting they are, how many rules they break for being mammals. They kind of break all of the rules of being mammals. They fly. They're the only mammals that do that. So I'm going to go with bats.
Have you ever been hurt or bit by any of these animals?
I have been bit by several of them, yes. Yeah. I'm always wearing gloves, so I'm well protected. Good. I also have like a pre-exposure prophylactic immunization against rabies. And
we're going to talk about rabies. We will. Before we launch into bats and the study that you're currently doing with the RWA, could you take a few minutes and talk about what DEEP is, Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, what the mission is, and an overview of the department, just in case folks who are listening may not be familiar with it?
Sure. So there's kind of two branches, and it's in the name, right? There's energy and there's environmental protection. And I'm in the Bureau of Natural Resources, and so I really fall on the environmental protection side of it. But the global mission of the agency as a whole is to monitor and conserve and make accessible to the citizens of Connecticut our natural resources, and improving our energy infrastructure and access to affordable energy is the other side of it that I don't work with a lot, but it's all very much intertwined, right?
Right,
Energy and environment.
So deep, they're protecting our environment.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about bats. So the idea to have you on came from my good friend, the RWA forester, Casey Cords, who told me about this study that Deep was doing at our property that we're partnering with. So I wanted to kind of start at the beginning. Why our property? Why the RWA property for this study? And then second, at a very high level, what is the study?
Yeah, so the specific reason for my partnership or our partnership with RWA is that on one of your properties is something we call a hibernacula. And this is where bats go in the wintertime. Those that do hibernate will go underground in the winter and spend their winter in a deep hibernative state to survive resource shortages, aka no insects on the landscape when it's too cold.
Right.
And so this is just a very valuable resource for these animals. They depend on it to survive winters. There's a few of them across the state, but certainly the one that is on your guys' property is just a really critical one in terms of the number of bats it supports and the diversity of species that it supports.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So then to segue to the second part of the question, the idea is that we just really want to understand as much as we can about how bats are surviving. So about 15 years ago, this terrible disease was accidentally introduced. It's caused by a fungal species, a fungal pathogen, and it was brought over accidentally from Europe and introduced into our cave ecosystems. And it's a fungus that only affects hibernating bats, and it's killed millions, upwards of 7 million bats across the country at this point as it spreads west.
Is that white nose syndrome? Is that?
It is white nose syndrome, yeah. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, it is potentially the most catastrophic wildlife disease that we've ever witnessed. And the scary thing about fungal pathogens is that they can have a really broad host range. So most pathogens tend to be really host specific. They only affect one species. And so the pathogen itself has an incentive not to kill its host completely, not to drive extinction of one of its hosts. But fungus, because they can colonize multiple species, they're not limited. So we're really seeing, as close as we've ever witnessed, the driving of actual loss of species by a pathogen.
So I'll get back to the study, but since we started talking about the white nose syndrome, you said it was accidentally introduced.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we don't have the exact record of who and the what, and nobody's trying to point fingers. Most likely what happened is that somebody visited a cave. So let me back up a little bit. When we discovered what was happening to our bats here in North America, it kind of raised alarm bells across the globe because bats are critical components of ecosystems. They provide invaluable services, which I'm sure we'll talk about that as well. And so in Europe, where actually bats are pretty well protected in Europe, they started being like, well, we better look around and see if this is a problem and a threat to our own bats. And what they discovered was that it was kind of everywhere. The bats would get the characteristic white fungal growth on their nose and their wings, but they just kind of wake up and groom it off and shake it off, so to speak, and they're fine. They survive it. Whereas our bats, they get the infection and they wake up too frequently during winter when they're supposed to be conserving energy. And that process of waking up and bringing their body temperatures back up to normal temperatures is really energy costly. So they're burning through their fat reserves and they're starving to death.
So the European bats are able to kind of shake it off, but the American bats are dying from it.
Correct. So the thought is that the bats in Europe have been exposed to this or been living with this fungus for many thousands, potentially, of years. And so, if it affected them some thousands of years ago when it first started colonizing bats, that could have happened. We don't know. We don't have a record of that. But what we do know is that the bats there do okay, and our bats here are affected.
So it's almost like the way I'm thinking about this is if I go to another country and drink a glass of water, I might get a stomach issue for a while because my stomach's not issued to that or not used to that water. But the folks who live there are fine drinking that water. Kind of same thing.
Yeah, exactly. We're dealing with microbes, all of us, all the time. They're everywhere in the environment. We can't see them, and our immune systems are kind of constantly refining themselves to
Right.
adapt and tolerate all of these various microbes, right? And so the ones in Europe are adapted to it. Our bats are naive. So somebody probably went into a cave, not realizing, picked up some of the spores of this fungus and didn't clean their caving gear, and then came back and visited a cave in New York and introduced the fungal spores at that point.
Huh.
That's the most likely explanation. Again, we don't have
How long has this been an issue now for the bat population in the U.S.?
Yeah, so it showed up in 2006, 2007.
So it's really recent then.
It's pretty recent.
Wow.
Yeah, and like I said, it's continuing to march west, so it continues to spread. So even though here in the Northeast we've kind of been living with it for almost 20 years now, and our bats are kind of at the point where it's everywhere. They're used to it. They know it. They're either surviving or they're not. Some species do seem to be doing okay, but the Western species that still haven't encountered this yet, we're still kind of watching as it reaches new places and causes mortalities there. So
you are starting to see in your research a little bit that the bats in the East are starting to adapt a little bit, or?
There are some positive signs for at least one of our once most common species, which is the little brown bat. That used to be the most common bat in our landscape, and now they're very rare. There's another species that was also fairly common. This is called the northern long-eared bat. They don't seem to be recovering in the same way that little brown bats are. And so whether that's their ecology, whether they don't have the genetic background to be able to evolve the resistance that little brown bats, we don't know. We're still trying to parse through those questions. But essentially, we do have the potential of losing a species even now here in the Northeast that's still continuing to be affected by white nose syndrome.
So is this syndrome a part of the study that you're doing at the RWA property?
Yeah, kind of indirectly. I mean, every study at this point in North American hibernating bats is in some way related to white nose syndrome because that's the primary threat to their survival. But I think the focus of this really, and in the Northeast in general, because the disease has been here for so long, we're not going to stop it from spreading. We're not going to, provide a vaccine because the bats have already kind of initiated that process of evolving resistance naturally. So the onus on us is to promote their recovery at this point. It's not about preventing the disease. It's about promoting the recovery of the bats that are already surviving the disease. And so the property, the RWA property, not only does it host one of these hibernacula, one of these critical winter resources, it's also a really well-protected, buffered, forested area with a lot of resources for bats in the summertime. So we did a lot of work out there this summer, and a lot of acoustic work, which is where we go and put out these detectors that can hear bats and record their calls. And then we can take those calls and those recordings and go back and parse through and figure out which species are there and which species are not. And pretty much all of the species that do occur in Connecticut occur in appreciable numbers at this site in the summertime as well. So it's not only an important winter site, but it is actually also a very important summer site.
So this site at the RWA property hosts every native bat species in Connecticut.
Yes.
Is it the only one in the state, or are there others that you could find all? And how many how many bats are native to Connecticut? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Let's start with the basics, bat basics. So there are 9 species that occur in Connecticut. 2 of these are listed as federally endangered. One is called the Indiana bat, and that was federally listed many, many years ago, prior to even white nose. It was actually doing pretty well with new federal protections. Its populations were starting to recover a little bit, and then white nose came. Our records for this species in the state of Connecticut are very sparse. So we have records of it occurring here, but we don't see them very often, and we don't really think of them as Connecticut as being a very important part of their home range, their distribution. But that leaves us with 8 other species that do occur frequently, with some frequency here. We kind of group these into 2 categories. We call our tree bats and our cave bats. So cave bats are the ones that are affected by white nose syndrome. We call them cave bats because they go underground into caves and other subterranean environments for the winter and hibernate. Whereas the tree bats, they tend to migrate and go south and search, go for areas that will support some insect activity in the winter so they can survive.
So we got white nose syndrome. Like, what else, I guess, is there another main threat to the bat population that you're concerned about as a wildlife biologist?
Yeah. So bats are kind of one of the incredible things about bats is they're so diverse and they're doing so many different things um, that kind of there are multiple fronts that can affect their population. So um, climate change is a big one. I mean, I think for all wildlife, we're really kind of in this unknown territory of how our species going to respond to these changes that make seasonal transitions and kind of seasonal timing events less predictable. And uh, species in the wild that don't have, air conditioning that they can turn on when it gets too hot or heaters that they can turn on when it gets too cold, they really have to have some familiarity with the timing of seasonal events in order to survive and make the most and reproduce. So when you start making that really unpredictable, we're getting 90-degree days in the beginning of March, like the bats have to respond to that, right? So climate change is a big unknown that carries a lot of potential threat to them. So that's a big one. Habitat loss, kind of globally is a huge problem for bats. Not so much here in Connecticut. We have a lot of forests. And because of white nose syndrome, habitat loss is not the primary driver of their population declines. It's this disease. And so there's actually a lot of habitat available and just not a lot of bats. But that's peculiar to this area, right? But globally, habitat loss is a huge problem for bats. There's so many bats. There's over 1,400 different types of bats across the globe.
I was just going to ask that. And we only have 9 of them here.
We only have 9 of them here, but across the globe, there's a huge diversity of bats, and they're doing all sorts of different things. So our bats are all insectivores, which makes them really fundamentally important for all sorts of reasons, including public health and including cost of living. We can talk about that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. So actually, before I ask you that, you said 1,400 different types of bats. What's the difference in size between the largest bat and the smallest bat?
Great question. So, and I'm not going to give exact numbers because I don't have the exact numbers,
general.
but there's something called the bumblebee bat, which I believe is the smallest species of bat. And they probably weigh, the same amount as a couple of pennies.
Wow.
So just a few grams. They're very, very small. And then you have
size of a bumblebee or a little bigger?
A little bigger. Yeah, not much. About the size of a human thumb.
Oh, wow.
And then you can have, the giant fruit bats that occur in the old world tropics in places like Australia and, Indonesia. And in the old world tropics, there's fruit bats that they can have a wingspan up to 6 foot.
Wow.
So quite a huge diversity from size and shape and what they're doing. So like I said, fruit bats, they're eating primarily fruit, which means they're helping with seed dispersal and keeping forests healthy. There's nectar feeding bats whose primary job for us or service for us is pollination. So if any of you out there like tequila, bats are the primary pollinator for the agave plant from which tequila is fermented. So
interesting.
Whenever you're drinking your next margarita, you can just give a little cheers to the bats.
Cheers to the bats. And so, you kind of touched upon this, but I'll ask it. If I'm like Joe or Jane, homeowner in Connecticut, why should I care about bats?
So, not only from just somebody who cares about wildlife and is inspired by wildlife, bats, if you have a colony of bats living in your house, for example, or you have a bat house that's been colonized, watching them come out and just like go out and go about their business and foraging at night, it's a really fun family experience. It really can be. We have a lot of we have a bat cam that we have live streamed, a bat colony in Litchfield, Connecticut. It's a big brown bat colony. And just the amount of feedback and the amount of energy that goes into from the public, like watching these bats and helping us count them and being able to kind of eavesdrop and spy on them inside their roost. And then as they're coming out, it brings a lot of joy. They're really cool animals and they're just kind of mysterious and they're out at night. You don't really see them except for that dusk period. So I think there's that. But then there's also just the invaluable services that bats are providing. So nobody likes mosquitoes because mosquitoes are out to get us, literally, whereas bats are not. So bats eat all sorts of insect pests or insects that we consider pests, including crop pests. So, there was a study done about 12 years ago now that sort of modeled the economic value of bats to agricultural producers here in the United States. just in the United States, based on the research, bats are providing anywhere from $3 to $23 billion per year to agricultural producers in terms of free services, free pest control.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
what happens when you don't have free pest control, natural biological control? You have to compensate with pesticides.
With pesticides. Yeah, that's incredible. So we've talked about overall, I guess, do bats serve a special purpose, I guess, within a watershed like the RWA's watershed? And actually, before you answer that, so I would think one of the nice things about the area on the RWA property is that it's not open to the public, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a very secluded place. There's no human disruption of these bats, and that probably, I would imagine, I'm not a scientist, but would probably make it a pretty nifty place to study if you wanted to study bats, right?
Yeah, no, it's been lots of fun. We did a lot of trapping there this summer. A lot of bachelors, a lot of male bats on the landscape in RWA. So one thing that we're kind of learning is that perhaps one of the ways that we can help support the population is to provide some habitat for females, and that's providing bat houses or things. So some things are in the works to make the whole area more inviting for the females in the summer as well. So
just a bachelor pad out there at RWA property.
Seems to be. I caught a lot of males, mostly males, but there were some females too.
And how long is this study going on at our property?
Let's see. I started doing with just acoustic monitoring. I want to say it was like late summer of 22. I got out there and kind of started doing some initial acoustic monitoring. Summer of 23, I really expanded that and did a lot of acoustic monitoring around the property, and that's where I was discovering that, it supports a high activity level of all these rare species that we don't pick up in appreciable numbers in most other places in the state. So that was really exciting. And then this last summer, it was get out on the ground and actually do some capture and see what's going on. So
do you have a handle on roughly how many bats are in this specific location at the RWA property?
I do not. I can't give that answer. So
is it like a couple dozen, or is it hundreds, or like you wouldn't even be able to guess?
It's a great question. I don't know. One of the things about acoustics is that you go and you put this detector and this microphone out on the landscape, and you're just recording the bats as they fly by.
Oh, okay.
So let's say I get 20 tricolored bat calls. Well, was that one tricolored bat that flew by 20 times, or was it 20 different bats?
Oh, okay.
So what we can get from the acoustic data is more of an index of activity rather than an actual number of bats.
That's so interesting. So we were talking about agriculture, and as I was getting ready to talk to you, my buddy Casey sends me this recent article, a study about a connection between the decline in the bat population and human infant mortality. Mm-hmm. I'll just set it up there, and I'll let you kind of talk about this study, because I got to tell you, it blew my mind, and every time I think about it, it blows my mind. But then the more I think about it, I'm like, it makes perfect sense. So can you talk a little bit about this study?
I can, absolutely. So this was published in Science, which if you're an aspiring scientist, getting a publication in Science is one of the gold star goals, right? They're really well peer reviewed, and so it's not just a hand wavy connection that was made. And so what this researcher discovered, and it kind of tailed off a previous study that I think was published just a few years back, that showed that land values in areas where, for agricultural producers, the cost of land was going up in areas where white nose had hit because there's fewer bats. And when you have fewer bats, I already mentioned, you have less biological control of pests, which means that the farmers have to use more insecticides, more toxic chemicals in order to get the produce out, right? So you kind of have two dimensions that affect our everyday life, right? If agricultural producers have to spend more to get their crops out to you, it means you have to pay more for those crops. So, we're all living in a pretty expensive time right now. So that's one thing, bats are actually impacting our wallets, but making the tie to human health is something that, as scientists and people who have long cared about bats and long thought about this, seems intuitive, right? If you have fewer bats, you have more pesticides. That's going to impact human health. And so for years, all the biologists have been saying this, but not really had that kind of publication to point to and say, no, this is happening, and we're observing this. So the fact that because humans are consuming agricultural products that were produced using higher levels of insecticides, that's having an impact, direct impact on our health, and unfortunately, a really tragic impact on infant mortality, which nobody wants to see. So.
Yeah, so they basically linked. They're saying that the less bats there are to eat the bugs, the more pesticides the farmers have to use, the more pesticides babies are ingesting, and it's having a very negative effect on their health and even killing babies.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a comfortable reality to kind of negotiate, right?
Yeah.
None of us want to think about that, but that really goes to the onus being on humans to realize that we don't exist exclusively on this planet in the absence of other things that are we have controls to make our lives better, and we can engineer things, and we can survive what we think without the aid of the natural environment. But actually the natural environment is providing services for us that we can't possibly, even the greatest feats of engineering can't replace and can't replicate these services. So as we lose biodiversity, and bats as an example, we very well will likely see all sorts of these really strong connections between our health and the degradation of our natural resources.
So I just had a thought, and if this is a really stupid question,
no such thing.
Please tell me it is. So you said the bats in Europe have built up this kind of tolerance to the white nose syndrome. Could you take some of those European bats, introduce them into our ecosystem, like if they're the same brown bat or the same kind of bat we have here, the same species of bat? Could you do that, and then through breeding would you start getting bats that are more tolerant?
Well, the problem is that they're not the same bats that we have here.
They're not the same
right?
species.
Yeah,
okay.
No, they're not the same species. So what we would be doing is just replacing our native species with a non-native species.
Okay.
And there's all sorts of reasons that might not be good for the European bats either, right? They've evolved to a European climate. They've evolved to that landscape. So bringing them over here, wouldn't be super fair to them. It wouldn't be super fair to our bats because they might outcompete them simply because they can survive white nose. So, again, there's so many brilliant minds. I always say that the only silver lining to white nose syndrome is that it raised a lot of awareness and actually brought a lot of funding resources available for people to study bats. And prior to white nose, there wasn't a lot of money for bat research, even though they're so critically important and they make up such a huge part of our biomass that they should get more attention, especially with all the services they do. So white nose bad, but the silver lining is that there's more attention being focused on bats, and we're learning a lot about them. And so that being said, there actually are some really amazing scientific minds and collaborations to produce vaccines and to figure out other ways of treating the bats kind of on the front range of the disease, so that those areas where the fungus is just arriving don't have the same drastic population declines that we have here. But again, that being said, we've been dealing with it for about 15 years now. So the bats that are surviving on the landscape are surviving white nose syndrome. And so evolution, natural selection is doing its job.
Happening, yeah.
It's just that, so bats reproduce very slowly. When I said that they break all the rules of being mammals, right? They're really small, at least our bats, very small-bodied little animals. Typically, small-bodied mammals have very short lifespans and have really high reproductive output. So live fast, breed hard, die young model. Bats don't follow that model. Bats live really long lives.
So what's really long?
Like 40 years.
Wow.
For a 7-gram animal. We've got records of up to 40 years in a Myotis species, which is just incredible for an animal that's no bigger than the palm of your hand. And they also only have typically 1 pup per female per year. So very slow reproductive output, which means that even in the best possible conditions, it's going to take decades, if not longer, for the recovery of losing, because we lost, upwards of 90% of some of our populations of some of our species. So the little brown bat, 95% or so we lost. Northern long-eared's 99%. So in the best possible scenario where they don't have to deal with climate change and they don't have to deal with habitat loss and they don't have to deal with pesticides and, limited insect populations, because we're also losing biomass of insects as well, it would still take a really long time for them to recover, and they don't have the best possible conditions to do that with. So the onus, again, is on us to really promote their recovery as much as we can.
Do bats have a natural predator? Is anybody hunting bats out there?
Yeah.
Like, I should say anybody. Any other animals hunting bats for food?
Yeah, no, there are definitely some predators. Bats make it hard for predators, right?
Because
Because
they're out
they're
at night
flying and they're
and they're
coming out at
flying.
night.
Yeah.
And they're really good at what they do. So they're very good flyers, very maneuverable. But there's been a lot of like, curious scientists will go and they'll put a thermal camera at the entrance of a tunnel or a cave that's used by bats, and wouldn't you know it, cats. Cats sitting at the base and just waiting for a bat to come out. And since cats are so good at what they do, cats are hammering bats a little bit. But they have other things. There's a species called free-tailed bats, and if anybody has been to the bridge in Austin, Texas, it's kind of a famous
I've heard of that.
colony or roost site for one of these colonies. And they come out and it's a tornado of bats every night. About an hour before sunset, you start to get this column of millions of bats streaming out of these caves or bridges or whatever. And so the hawks have learned, right around 6 o'clock is dinner time, and they just sit there and they wait.
And they just pick them off.
Pick them off. I was in a cave.
Have you ever been there in
Yes.
Austin? You've gone to that?
I have. Yeah.
That's awesome.
I was the only person that didn't mind getting peed on by the I was standing under there. I was like, I don't care. I can feel him peeing on me. I don't care. And then in Puerto Rico, I visited a cave in Puerto Rico once, and there's a species of boa constrictor that has evolved specifically to hang on the outside of this cave as the bats are coming out. So they have a few predators.
So, a boa constrictor. So it's just like catching them with their mouth? Like
it was the craziest thing. The snakes are basically like, they're all muscle. A snake is just like
a big muscle.
2 foot long muscle, basically. So they can kind of hold on to the crevices of the rocks with just like one small portion of their body or their tail, and then that gives them enough strike capacity to be able to catch a bat. And bats are moving so fast, it's really fantastic that these snakes can do this.
That's wild.
It was pretty phenomenal to observe. I felt bad for the bats, but also, snake got to eat too.
Listen, that's nature, right?
Yeah.
There's a food chain, and you just have to. It's sad sometimes, but you have to just let nature take its course.
It does. There's no fighting that.
So is there anything else about this study that you think it's important to talk about? I have some other topics I want to move on to, but I want to make sure we kind of talk about this study, get all the information out there.
Yeah. So I'm kind of moving into the next phase of this study, and this is going to involve, the RWA site as well as a few other of these hibernacula, these sites. And so I have a student at UConn who's going to be doing winter ecology work. One of my big kind of questions, I'm new to Connecticut. I moved here from California in 21. So still very new to like the seasonal timing of things and the seasons themselves.
Seasons.
We have seasons here,
seasons.
which we don't have in California. So just trying to understand how bats are responding to, an ever increasingly changing climatic conditions, and how their winter ecology is going to be affected by that. So we've got basically one of these acoustic monitors that is active year round at the entrance of this hibernacula. And just from last winter, bats do wake up naturally throughout the winter. They wake up, once every 2-3 weeks, kind of stretch their wings, maybe get a drink of water, and then go back to sleep. And that's natural. White nose makes that interval between those arousals shorter, so that they're waking up too frequently. But also climate might be making them wake up and sending them cues, even though they're kind of in a subterranean environment. One thing that
if you get like a day in January that's 60 degrees,
Yes.
their body may be, it's March.
Yeah. So they were really active throughout the entire winter last winter, just acoustically. And so we just really kind of want to figure that out. How far are they moving from the hibernacula when they do go out on these little outings? Are they foraging successfully? Are there any insects for them to forage on? So those types of questions, I think, is the next phase.
Thing. So what is it about the white nose that wakes them up? Is it just like, does it fill their nostrils and they can't breathe? Or
It's a great
curious.
question. There's kind of multiple opinions on that, and probably it's all of the above. One thing is that the fungus actually invades their wing tissue, and it causes these like really necrotic like lesions. It basically just decimates their wing tissue. Their wing tissue is really important for water balance in the wintertime when they're just, everything else is shut down, right? They shut their bodies down and they just kind of go to sleep. But their wings provide a really important surface for water transport and exchange. So if that tissue goes back, they might be really thirsty and just dehydrated. It could be that it's just irritating them. Again, it's chewing away at their wings and it's invading, getting into the cells. So
and the wing tissue is very delicate, right? Because I've seen it's almost translucent.
It is.
It's so delicate.
It is very translucent. Yeah, you can shine a light.
In fact, that's
so very delicate tissue and very critical to their survival, right? If they can't fly,
obviously,
that can't do much if it can't
right.
fly.
Then it's just a mouse.
Yeah. Oh, well.
No, that was a joke.
That's one of my favorite myths to dispel. I always get people being like, oh, bats are just rats with wings.
So we're going to do a whole segment on bat myths.
We'll get back to the bat myths.
Yeah.
I will correct that one.
Yeah.
Remind me.
No, so that's interesting. Actually, we are going to talk about bat myths right now because, it is October and everybody loves to talk about bats for, a couple of weeks a year in October. And there's a lot of myths out there about bats. So I'm just going to rattle off a few. You can tell me whether they're true or not, and then we can kind of talk about that. So the first one, bats are blind.
False.
False.
Bats are not blind.
Okay.
And in fact, those fruit bats that I was talking about, and if anybody Googles a picture of a flying fox, you'll see they have really big eyes. And generally, if something has really big eyes, it means it's really dependent on its vision. So, and they're eating fruit. That makes sense, right? They're actually using a visual search for their resources. Our bats here that are insectivores, they do have really teeny little eyes, but they still see probably about as well as we do in the dark.
Okay.
It's just that their hearing is so well tuned that that's the primary sensory mode that they're using to kind of navigate and get prey.
And that's echolocation, right?
Echolocation.
Yes. Yeah, I remember my 9th grade science.
Yeah.
And how does that work, right? So let me see if I can remember and you tell me if I'm right. They send out like a noise and the noise bounces off of what they're looking for and comes back to them, and that's how they're able to figure out where they're going, what they're doing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. They're emitting these really high frequency sounds that we can't hear as humans. If you can hear them, they basically sound like a series of clicks. But to the bat, they're doing it at such a high frequency, and right, the higher the this is a little physics lesson. The higher the frequency, right, the shorter the wavelength. So if you have a bunch of waves going over something, the shorter that wavelength is, the smaller the object that the wavelengths are passing over will actually encounter that object and bounce back. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Okay.
I'm visualizing it in my head right now.
So they have really high frequency, really short wavelengths, and so they can discern. There's some species of bats that actually, instead of catching, some just catch insects on the fly while they're flying around, and it's pretty amazing. They can track this moth, let's say, that's flying around and hone in on it, and they'll capture it on the fly. But other species are going and picking insects directly off of vegetation. So those species have to actually be able to discern an echo that's passing over something that might be 2 or 3 millimeters in length from the background leaf that it's on.
Oh, wow.
And that's how fine-tuned these animals are to be able to navigate in the dark. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a cave, like an underground cave, and turned their light off, but it's completely dark.
Yes.
These animals can navigate in and out without bumping into each other, without bumping into walls. Sometimes it's just a very narrow tunnel that's barely bigger than the bat, and they can get in and out. It's amazing what they can do.
That is amazing.
In the dark. So
next myth: all bats have rabies.
definitely false.
Definitely false.
Definitely false. So I like to put it this way, and this is a little bit of like mental gymnastics, and I probably will say it wrong the first time. But so from the data that we've been able to collect, the most unbiased data source is suggests that less than 1% of wild bats are actively infected with rabies. So that's a very small proportion of the population that's actually actively
Probably say that
infected.
about humans.
Yeah, and every mammal on the planet
Right.
can carry rabies, right? So it's not just bats that are a threat. Like any wildlife and any species can carry rabies. The problem with bats is that when people, I think the reason bats are responsible for a lot of the transmissions to humans is that if people encounter a bat, they grab it, they pick it up without gloves on, and they get bit. Whereas, you're less likely perhaps to encounter a raccoon or something bigger. and you
Right.
wouldn't pick up
You
a
wouldn't,
raccoon.
yeah, you wouldn't just grab a raccoon.
Right. So I think that's the reason that bats are responsible for a lot of that. So it's really the onus is on humans to be conscious and careful about how we approach wildlife in any context. You should really never handle wildlife without
Yeah.
gloves because you don't know what you can give to them too.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, so less than 1% of bats are actually actively carrying the virus. And so a good rule of thumb, or just something to kind of keep in mind, is that an encountered bat, a bat that you encounter, let's say it's grounded, can be grounded for all sorts of reasons. It can be dehydrated. It can be distressed. It could have, gotten hit by a cat or something and on the ground for that reason. So an encountered bat is not more likely to be sick, but a sick bat is more likely to be encountered.
So what about a bat in the middle of the day? If you see a bat in the middle of the day, I've heard that bat has rabies, because why would it be out in the middle of the day?
Not necessarily.
No? Okay.
Bats don't, they're not vampires. They don't burst into flames when they go out into the sun. So bats can be outside in the daytime for any number of reasons. One might be that perhaps the tree that they were roosting in got knocked down, or there's some other reason they got excluded from their roost. There's certainly some species that tend to be, like in the wintertime, we see a lot of eastern red bats, which are supposed to be migrating in the winter, but more and more they're kind of sticking around. So we are seeing at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we'll get a lot of eastern red bats flying around. And that's just because in the wintertime, if there's going to be insects on the landscape, they're not going to be out in the middle of the night when bats are used to foraging because it's too cold, but they might be out on a 50-degree, 60-degree day in the middle of December. So not all bats that you encounter are rabid. Just bear that in mind. But you should never handle a bat without a glove. And in fact, you should avoid handling the bat wherever possible.
Yeah, just call your local
call
animal control.
Exactly.
Next myth, I don't know if it's a myth, but there's one bat species that has a tongue that's 9 feet long.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I looked this up because I was like, that can't be right. So there are, I mentioned nectar-feeding bats, the ones that are pollinating things like agave. And so a lot of these bats have very long tongues to get down into a flower shaft and get that nectar. And so the bat that bit comes from does not have a 9-foot tongue, but its tongue is about 150% the length of its body.
Wow.
And so if it were a human, it would have about a 9-foot tongue.
Oh, okay.
But as is, I think it's closer to about 9 centimeters. But when you're a 2.5 centimeter bat,
right, that's
or a
pretty
5
big.
centimeter bat, that's pretty big.
Yeah. The last myth you kind of brought up a little bit. If a bat bites you, you'll turn into a vampire. That one's true, right?
That's not totally true. No, definitely not true.
Yeah.
So out of the 1,400 different types of bats that are flying around our planet, there's only 3 that are what we call sanguivorous or blood feeding. And they all live in the South America, Central America, Mexico, so the New World tropics. And 2 of those specialize in birds. So only one, the common vampire bat, actually.
I was going to say, there is a vampire bat.
There are. There's 3 of them.
Yeah, there's 3 different types of vampire bats.
So
would you say Dracula did for bats what Jaws did for sharks? Did bats have such a bad rap before Dracula came out?
So in some cultures, in China, bats are considered an omen of good luck. And so I think there's definitely cultural differences. I do think that link, and I think it was Bram Stoker's Dracula that made that first, vampires and bats, they go together. That's a good question. I don't know if it's been bad for bats. It certainly has people thinking about bats, which isn't the worst thing, right? But it's definitely not a fair description.
Yeah.
It's definitely mythology, right? And it's for our fun. It has no basis in reality.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that Bram Stoker picked the bat to kind of transform from Dracula into a bat. He could have picked a parrot or a pigeon.
Sure, but bats are out at night, right? You don't see them directly. So I think humans have the tendency to fear things that we don't understand, right? So if you have no knowledge of something, and the only thing that you see of it is this whisper of this thing that flutters past your head in the dark, right? That's almost like ghost-like, right? Almost like a phantom.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a pretty natural connection to the spookiness of bats, just because anything that's nocturnal also kind of gets wrapped into Halloween as well. So I think that, I don't know. we won't get too mad at Bram Stoker. He wrote a pretty cool story. But...
It is, yeah, and it's lived on for a long time.
On,
My
yeah.
goodness, if people made a lot of money off that story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have one last question before we go to 5 unrelated questions. It's not something you and I kind of discussed beforehand, and I want to preface it by saying I just want to know your personal feelings about this, because it's a little controversial, but it's just something I'm curious about that I just thought about as we were talking, and that's COVID. So as a bat expert, when COVID came about and you started hearing these stories that it was a bat in China, what did you think personally when you started hearing all that? Did you think that it could be legitimate? Did you think that it was complete hogwash? Just curious.
Well, so there were actually two coronaviruses that emerged and affected humans prior to COVID-19, which was the first SARS, and then there was one called MERS, which is the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And, you know, the genetics and the molecular pathways that we have to investigate the origin of these viruses does suggest that a bat was the original host. And it does make sense. Bats they make really good hosts or reservoirs for diseases because it's thought because of their flight and the fact that they can fly and the metabolic cost of that, evolution has kind of shifted the way their body tolerates and handles things like viruses. And so their strategy is to allow low levels of viral replication within their body, but not enough to actually make them sick. Oh. And so that being said, I don't want to give bats a bad rep. Like, they're all part of the problem is that, you know, as you increase contact between humans and wild populations, there's all sorts of viruses that are circulating. Viruses are way smarter than humans and way smarter than most mammals. They have figured out evolution. They're very good at what they do.
Yeah.
And they're trying to survive too. So really, I don't blame the bats for being bats and having things that we all have. We all have our own set of little viruses inside us, which is why I say you also want to protect wildlife from us as well. And so for me, of course, there was a concern that was going to further vilify bats in the public mind if that's the narrative. But the true narrative that we should be focusing on is that the more humans encroach upon wild populations and make it such that every species on the planet right now is stressed in some way, right? Whether that's climate, whether that's habitat loss, whether that's any myriad of reasons that humans impact the environment and impact natural populations, they're all stressed. And what happens when we're stressed? We get sick, right? So if a stressed animal is just as equally likely or more likely to get sick and to have viruses, you know, surviving in it as we are when we get stressed out, right? We're more likely to get sick. It messes with your immune system. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that we should villainize bats for carrying these things. We need to be more conscious of how we're interacting with our natural environment so that we keep ourselves healthy and them healthy. Because you can't just say, oh, well, bats are giving us diseases, therefore we should kill all bats. Well, what happens when you kill all bats? We have to use more pesticides, and we watch as infant mortality rates go up.
Right.
So,
and it's not like a bat just gave us a disease. It took a human-bat interaction to give us that disease.
And a forced human-bat interaction,
exactly,
right? The bat didn't want to be
the
like
bat
collected.
the bat didn't like bang down your door and break into your house.
You banged down its door. We banged down its door and came to its house. Yeah.
Well, I do appreciate that. Was a very thoughtful response to a question that I didn't even know I had until halfway through this interview. So I do appreciate that.
It's a very good question. Yeah. It's a good thing for us all to think about.
So we are now going to turn to the segment I like to call 5 unrelated questions. It's 5 questions that have nothing to do with bats. It's just a little get to know you better kind of segment. And we'll start with, do you have any pets?
I do. I have a lovely little dog named Jerome.
What kind?
He is like I think he's a pit lab. No, I think he's a pit boxer mix, actually. For years, I thought he was a pit lab mix, but then I saw somebody else's pit boxer, and I was like, that looks just like my dog.
That's Jerome. And how long have you had him?
I've had him for just over 10 years now.
Oh, wow.
He was a rescue, and he is just the best.
He's a good boy.
He is a good boy.
What is your favorite band or musician?
Ooh. I don't know if I have one, so I'm going to give you 3.
Okay, you can give me 3.
These are my go-tos when I'm like cleaning my house on a Sunday or something, and I just want to like feel good. One is Paul Simon, specifically Graceland. Like every song on that album, I just love. Dave Matthews will always put me in a good mood. And then if I really feel like dancing or whatever, then I like Sublime.
Sublime.
I grew up in
okay.
the 90s.
So did I. So did I. I had my very good friend in New Jersey has seen Dave Matthews 87 times.
Wow.
Yes, he goes 2 to 3 times a year, and it's just the thing that him and his brother do every year. I think it's 87 now. He's seen
Dude.
Dave. I've seen Dave Matthews probably 13 or 14.
I am jealous. I've
Yeah.
only seen him 3.
Yeah,
He taught himself guitar. Like, he taught him, like, and he's just such a quirky dude.
he is very quirky.
He's
yeah,
very quirky, and I love it.
yeah. I met Paul Simon once, and he's very short.
Did you? Yes,
Yeah.
he is very teeny. I'll never forget the video he did with Chevy Chase.
Yes,
Call
yeah,
Me
Call Me
Out.
Al, yeah. Yeah, he's a little ornery, too.
Is he?
Yeah.
But he's brilliant.
Yeah,
Musical
he is.
genius.
He is.
Warrants
Simon
some
and
ornery.
Garfunkel is
Yeah.
just I just probably 2 weeks ago watched the concert in Central Park again. It was on PBS.
Oh, nice.
Anytime it's on, I just love
I
it.
love that. I love that.
What's your favorite hobby outside of bats?
So lately, I just bought a house last year, and I've gotten really into home renovate, like DIYing everything. So that's been consuming most of my spare time lately. Prior to that, it was probably snowboarding.
Nice. Do you have any power tools?
Yeah, I got all the ones you need
Table
to
saws,
build a
chop
bathroom. I
saws,
don't
or-
have a table saw.
Nah.
I kind of make do. Like, I'm definitely like the janky DIYer that just makes do with whatever tools I
Yeah.
have. But I have a good, I have a hammer drill.
Nice. Great. Cookies, brownies, or ice cream? You can only pick one.
Cookies,
Cookies, what kind?
chocolate chip.
Chocolate chip. Nice. Last question and 5 unrelated questions. Who was your favorite teacher in school and why?
Ooh. I've had so many wonderful teachers that it's really hard to say. None of them will be listening to this because they're all in California, so I don't have to hurt anybody's feelings. So my 4th grade teacher, Miss LaBerge, was just so awesome. She was just this feisty. She was like the PE teacher, but also just made learning so engaging. My sister had her in 6th grade, and then my sister is 3 years older than me, and then she moved to 4th grade. So I got her like right after my sister had her. And I don't know, she was a really inspiring teacher. And then, God, can I only give one?
I'll let you give another.
Mr.
We got a few.
Guillermo in junior high, and then he moved to high school. He was my history teacher, and Mr. G, man, he just rocked. He was just such a good, inspiring teacher. But I so value teachers and what they provide for students and youth, and I feel like they should be more treasured in our society. For
I
sure.
agree, and that's why I asked this question, because I don't even think teachers understand the impact they have on lives. So I love to just let people talk about the teachers that impacted their lives, because chances are that teacher doesn't know that, you and I are roughly the same age. That teacher probably doesn't know, 35 years later, somebody's still thinking about
totally.
them. And I still think about, I was friends with my high school guidance counselor till the day she passed away last year.
I'm sorry to hear that.
So a 30+ year friendship.
Amazing. And yeah, like I can remember I can remember the name of every teacher
Me too.
I've ever had.
Me too. Some great, some not so great.
Yeah, of course.
I had the opposite. So my brothers were a little bit troublemakers, so I always had to spend the first month of school proving that I was not a troublemaker, because I came in with a WotC last night, and they're, oh no, another WotC. And it took me about a month to convince them I was just not another WotC.
That is hilarious. Same situation. My
Yeah.
sister was a bit of a troublemaker,
Yeah.
and I was like the good student.
Well, listen, thank you for coming on the show. This has been so interesting. I love talking about things that I know nothing about coming in. I learned so much. So if you're out there listening, the one thing that I hope you take away from today's show is that bats are special. Bats are important to our ecosystem, to our agriculture, to our environment, to our wallets. Bats make produce cheaper if we have a lot of bats. If you encounter a bat, don't touch it. Call the proper animal control, and let's all celebrate bats, because they are doing an enormous service for us humans in this world. So with that, you have been listening to Liquid Lunch with the Regional Water Authority. I'll remind you again, you can view us anytime on the New Haven Independence YouTube page, or download us as podcasts on Spotify or Apple. Until our next show, I hope you stay happy and stay hydrated.